I'm a fairly reliable person and have no real reason to make this up. I was also sober when I saw this. In the summer of 2015, friends and I were out in the middle of nowhere in Missouri, looking for ghosts. We had been looking for a place to do an EVP session, and had finally found the perfect spot. It was a little used gravel road that turned off into another little used gravel road, hidden by thicker trees. There was even an older house on the other side of the forest border. We parked in front of this abandoned house next to the tree line, facing west toward a large field. This was right around 9:40 p.m. We gathered around a fire that we had built. We were there for about an hour, telling ghost stories and trying to make something happen. Finally, it was probably closer to about 11 p.m., we turned off all the lights in the car and sat staring in the field with night vision goggles that my friend was borrowing from work. After maybe about another hour, everybody at this point was pretty lax. We were talking and joking around. I happened to be looking right out of the car, towards the tree line, when I see this large black figure that swooped down from the trees and fly over the field. It was huge and had large bat-like wings, much larger than any bat I'd ever seen. The wingspan alone had to have at least been 10 feet. I remember all of us seeing it, screaming. We weren't sure what to do. We floored the car and drove away. I don't think any of us slept at all that night. We pulled away about 10 minutes down the road, got out and tried to ascertain what we saw. None of us could believe what we had just seen. I put it out of my mind for about a week or so, until I started seeing articles online about giant bats attacking people here in Missouri. I can't remember which article it was now. It might have been one of the articles that author John Keel wrote, but there were several human victims who claimed to have been attacked by giant bats in the 80s and early 90s. These people all described wings that were 5 to 10 feet wide. We also had with us a Ouija board that we were planning to use in conjunction with an EVP to see if we could connect to any spirits. We never did end up using it, but I almost wonder if that board is the reason we saw what we did. I wonder if we had somehow summoned that bat thing, or maybe it was just curious about us. I can't help but think that it might have been a demonic entity. Has anybody out there seen anything remotely like what we did? Anything similar? I know winged and flying humanoids are a thing, but I just can't help but think that they're all demonic. When I was young, my grandmother always scared me with stories of El Chupacabra. We're originally from Puerto Rico, moved here to Missouri when I was very little, so pretty much everybody has heard of them. I was never really that scared of it because I knew in my deep subconscious it could not be real. According to my grandmother, it's a creature the size of a bear with spines down its back, as well as large fangs. It came after little kids who played outside for too long or did not listen to their elders. At least, that's what my G-Ma told me. Even though I didn't believe it, every time I was late home or I talked back to my grandma, I would get that fear in my bones from the Chupacabra hurting me, or something. I remember this distinctly. So, on my 11th birthday, my parents were both working, so my grandma baked me a cake. I had some friends over at her house, so I could have a party, but she was still able to look after us. The party was really nice, and everybody had a good time. That night, I went to sleep later than usual, with good reasons obviously, because some of the kids left really late. I always slept with the door closed at my grandma's place, so that night, I closed it as well. Just as I was falling asleep, I heard something at the window. It was like tree branches were hitting it, being moved by the wind. I didn't pay that much attention to it and just ignored it. The second time, something hit my window really hard and I figured I had to check it out at what was going on outside. I wish I had not gone to the window, because when I did, I saw something that left me terrified for the rest of my life. Across the street from my grandma's house, there were some bushes. When I looked, they were shaking and it seemed like somebody was hiding behind them or something. And just as I was about to turn around and go to sleep, it came out. It was a huge creature that looked exactly like the stories my grandmother told me about, of the Chupacabra. I screamed, ran to my grandparents' room to tell them what I saw, and get them to scare the monster away. I was just a kid, so I really believed that my grandmother thought the Chupacabra existed, and when she told me it wasn't real, I tried to convince her with all my power that it was. When they came to my window to see what I was talking about, this thing was gone. They did not believe me, no matter how hard I tried to convince them, and now I understand them. I would not believe a kid with something like that either. Kids have a great imagination, but I can only wish I had imagined it. I did not want to sleep at my grandma's anymore. I was afraid I would see it again. 2 weeks had passed since this happened, and only one day I was walking home alone from my school since my parents were both working and could not pick me up. It was getting dark, and even though I had kind of forgotten about what had happened, I was still a little scared to be walking alone, and for good reason, apparently. Just as I was supposed to pass the nearby park, I heard something from behind. There were strange noises and loud footsteps. I was afraid to turn around and speed up, so I would get further away from it. But it sped up with me and kept following. I started running as my house was just around the corner, but it started running too. Somehow, I made it into my house. I locked the door as soon as I got in. I did not even notice when I lost it or even what it was. At no point did I have the courage to turn around, and maybe it's better that I didn't. I probably wouldn't be able to handle what happened later. We were on a school trip to the nearby lake. It was like a one-day field trip type thing, and all my friends were going. I didn't know how or why, but I kept forgetting about the scary things that were happening to me. It was probably because I was a kid and didn't take it seriously. If all this happened now, I wouldn't even know how to act. So, the field trip was mostly spending time in the bus, and when we got there, we all got lunch boxes and an hour to explore the area around the lake. But there was no going into the forest or far away, where the teachers could not see us. My friends and I played tag, and we got caught up in that. We didn't even notice we were in the woods. As I realized it, fear had come over me, and I got paralyzed. When suddenly, we had heard the teacher calling for us and approaching the woods, so everybody quickly ran out of the woods. As I was running, I noticed a butterfly. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I tried to catch it, but I couldn't get to it because it was too fast. My friend Damien called out to me as he was exiting the woods. I yelled that I would be right out. I slowed my steps. The danger was gone, as the teacher saw we were all okay. At that exact moment, a branch had broke from behind me, and as a reflex, I turned around. I saw what I saw from my grandma's window that night. That's all I remember before waking up in the hospital. I fainted. They found me at the entry of the forest by the tree line. They had asked me what had happened and why I was lying on the ground unconscious. I told them. They did not believe me. Some kids even made fun of me at school because of what I said. All I know is that I'm now 30, but I still know that somewhere out there, a Chupacabra is probably waiting to hurt me. I have a scientific background. I'm reasonably intelligent and rational. I try not to be gullible. I'm not a nut, and I don't have a wild imagination. However, this experience alone was so unusual. I don't know what to make of it. Two people, my wife and I, were driving down on a rural highway near St. Louis in the early evening hours of August 10th, 2002, when we both saw a large owl-like creature perched on a utility pole about 60 yards ahead of us. The creature was completely white, about the size of a large bird, with a 6-foot wingspan. It had a round head and large eyes. My wife mentioned it, how odd it looked, and the fact that it was perched strangely. The closer we got, we could just see how frightening it looked and how strange it looked. We were both startled, and my wife even screamed. The creature flew off into the night sky and we drove onward to our destination, discussing what we had just seen. We both agreed that it wasn't a bird. It wasn't an ordinary person either. It was definitely something other. We get to our destination about 10 minutes later, talking about the creature. My wife said she wanted to turn around and go back so she could show me the exact spot where the creature had perched on the pole. I agreed. We turned around. We drove back the way we had come and couldn't find the creature or the utility pole. We were both very shaken up by what we had just seen. Now, I'll try my best to give the best description of the creature from memory. White feathers, sort of glimmering white. Big round head with large eyes that seemed to glow from within. A round body with a lanky torso, and 2 legs with what appeared to be webbed feet. I did not notice arms, but it was dark, so I could have missed them if they were tucked close to the body. Wings that didn't flap in flight. Rather, they seemed to be more gliding or floating. At the moment of the initial sighting, my wife said it reminded her of an owl, but I didn't see that resemblance because I wasn't expecting to fly off when we approached. If I'd seen it perched, I may have described it as an owl. The wings were something closer to 6 feet. The eyes also seemed strange, and to have this glow like an inner light. It was very strange. Even now I think back to this creature, I get a chill. I'm not the type to believe in anything paranormal, but this was very, very strange for both of us. I come from Nevada, for those who don't know what that means. The state is huge, but there isn't anything really special to see here. Most of the land is barren, and there aren't many trees, only bushes and the occasional grassland. I've now since moved to Missouri, where I've had a host of strange, terrifying things happen, but before I get to that, let me tell you that Nevada is hell on earth in the summer. Very few shades and dry heat, and I can't stand the sun. Living here during summer makes me feel like somebody stuffed me in an oven, leaving me to die. There are lots of great places for camping though, and sometimes I and a few friends would pack up our gear and pitch a tent for the night. We would only spend one night outside and pack up before dawn because, as I said, the heat can be too much to handle. Now, after moving to Missouri, I stuck with those same friends. We planned to spend more than one night. We packed up everything we could think of and tried to look for the shadiest, coolest place possible to make our camp. We set up our camping spot far away from any civilization. This way, nobody could ever bother us and kept our rides close by. This way we can cool off in the car tomorrow. About halfway through the night, one of my friends and I decided to go for a hike around the area. Now, it was a full moon, and since there weren't many trees, everything was pretty well lit. We walked in circles for about an hour, talking about life and whatnot, when suddenly we heard a cry in the distance. It sounded like a person pleading for their life. It was coming behind just a small hill just ahead of us. We couldn't really make out what the person was saying, but somebody was definitely in trouble. We knew that running to a random sound in the middle of the night wasn't exactly the smartest idea. So, we started slowly sneaking towards the place the sound had come from. We made it to the top of a small hill, but there was no signs of anybody. We were certain that we did not imagine the sound, but did not want to push our luck. We turned around to head back. Just then, we heard something yet again. This time, we could hear almost somebody trying to scream for help, but the sound was muffled, like somebody was holding a hand over the person's mouth. This time, the sound wasn't too far from us, and we could see the bushes from where it was coming from. Keep in mind that these aren't the bushes like you have in your backyard. They are over 4 feet tall, and can scratch you pretty good if you run through them. We sneaked close to the bushes to try and figure out what was going on, but the plea for help stopped. The next thing we heard made both of us freeze in place and freak out. The call for help suddenly turned into maniacal laughter. At first it was quiet, but it grew louder and more intense. The worst part is, it did not sound like a human. It resembled a hyena's laughter, which I've only heard on TV. We took a few steps back from the bushes, and before we could make a run for it, some weird-looking creature poked its head out of the bushes. It was a little smaller than a donkey, and it had a body that looked like somebody mixed a German shepherd with a hyena, but its fur had a strange red pattern on it. If that wasn't terrifying enough, its teeth looked like they all could not fit inside its mouth. The fangs were long and sharp, and they were sticking out, even when the creature's mouth was closed. We slowly walked backward, and the creature emerged from the bushes. Its appearance became even weirder after we could see its legs. You would expect an animal like this to have paws and sharp claws, but instead, we could see hooves, strong like ram hooves. While walking out, the creature was laughing uncontrollably, and that sound made us even more terrified. Somehow, we both knew that we could not outrun this thing, and we started screaming for help, hoping that at least our other friends could hear us. The creature did not seem to like this. It stopped laughing and grinned its mouth at us. The laughter seemed to slowly fade into a growl, like the same one a rabid dog would make. In a split second, this thing charged at us, galloping like a racehorse, sinking its teeth in my shorts. Luckily, it didn't touch my flesh, but it grabbed hold of my clothes, strong enough to pull me down with a flick of its head. It made a sound that sounded like a mix of growling and laughing, almost as if it was satisfied with how easy it took me down. It turned its attention to my friend, and charged at him too. In the process, it stepped on my back with one of its hooves, and it hurt like hell. I could almost feel a bruise coming up just seconds later. The next thing I know, both the creatures and my friend were wrestling on the ground, and I could hear the sound of tearing clothing. The beast was ripping his shirt apart, piece by piece. And suddenly, I heard a familiar sound and saw a blast of light coming from between them, and the creature let out a groan of pain and backed off from my friend. I could see him slowly get up without a shirt, with a taser in his hand that was still sparking. I never knew he carried one with him, but I was glad he did. For the next few seconds, the beast and my friend stared off at each other. The taser probably hurt it enough, because it slowly backed away and retreated into the bush. I thanked my friend and we quickly went back to camp. Some days later, I did some research on the internet and stumbled upon a mythical creature. Its physical appearance matched perfectly with the creature we had met. It said that this creature can mimic human speech to lure its victims, which would explain the cry for help we had heard. I'm almost certain that this creature is not just a myth, and there's at least one lurking somewhere in Nevada. Now, while that was my crazy encounter from Nevada, Missouri has its own fair share of nightmares to share. I'll have to send more in a separate email, but I've also seen similar creatures like this, what I saw in Nevada and Missouri. In fact, I think there are more out here, lurking around in the woods. I wanted to share with you my Nevada story to let you know that I have experience with cryptids, because recently, when I was in a cabin up in the wintertime here in Missouri, I caught something with large black eyes staring into my cabin window. I tried my best not to scream, but it only came around at night. Since I got out of the cabin and have come back down the mountainside for spring, I've not seen it since. Anyway, I could go on and on about all the stories I have with dealing with these monsters. They seem to follow me no matter what state I'm in. Let me know if you'd like to hear more, and I'll gladly write a bunch up for you. In 1992, I was living with my girlfriend, who is now my wife of 20 plus years. At the time, we lived in a small duplex in a little town outside of Edna, located outside of St. Louis. So, I was familiar with the whole legend of the hawkman and other local sighting stories that had been popping up prior to our own sighting. Well, one afternoon, my wife and I were sitting on our couch watching TV. I remember it was around 3 p.m. As I said, we lived in a duplex, and the living room window is basically on the front corner of the house. We were sitting facing the window, and I just so happened to be looking out it when I saw what I thought was a very large flying object, or bird, flying very low, just south of our duplex. It was so large and so close, I thought it was going to smash into the roof of our apartment. We were on the second floor. But it pulled up and over a few trees, doing kind of a loop as it passed. It took about 5 seconds for my wife and I to process what we had just seen, and both came to the same conclusion. That was not a bird. The sighting has shocked us, scared us, and intrigued us both ever since. The fact that it was flying so low right in front of our house and looping over a few trees made it very real to us. I'm still not quite sure what we saw, but I'm confident this was possibly paranormal, or we really did see the hawkman. I was hunting around 2012 November or December. I can't remember which one was which, but it wasn't too long ago, so I'm not sure why my memory is so blurry about the date. I was up in a tree stand, bow hunting for deer in the backwoods of Missouri. It was getting close to dusk, and I had not seen anything all day. I was just sitting there, dozing off a bit, when I heard something coming through the woods towards me. At first, I thought it was a deer, but then I noticed that it was walking on 2 legs and coming up the path towards where my tree stand is. I could see and make out that it was a large, hairy, dog-like creature, easily 8 feet tall and massive, rippling muscles. It was also walking upright, the same way a man would. I didn't know what to do. I sat there and watched it as it came closer. It was looking right up at me, and I could see its eyes. I was terrified. I couldn't move. Then, everything around me got quiet. I was too frightened to look out my deer stand to see if it was still there, so I sat there waiting for it to go away. I honestly don't know how long I waited, but eventually I must have dozed off. The next thing I know, the sounds of the forest start coming back. I was probably sitting up there for a good couple of hours before things returned to normal. I know it saw me. I know that for a fact. I don't know what it was, but it definitely was not a regular deer or wolf, or any other kind of animal I'd ever seen before. I called out to a couple of my buddies and told them what had happened. One of them said he knew somebody who had a very similar experience as I. He said the creature was called the Missouri Wildman. I never did find anything with that information because, honestly, after that day, I didn't think I wanted to know anything more. I just kind of want to forget that it ever happened. I never did see this thing again, but since that day, strange things have been happening around my house. Like, for example, I usually leave my porch light on at night, but ever since, this strange looming feeling sits around my house that makes me feel uncomfortable, like there's something there. There's even times that I swear I see those same red eyes staring back at me through the woodline by my house, or I get this overwhelming sensation that I'm being watched by something or someone. I can never get a good look at it, though. The whole thing has left me shaken. I'm still trying to find ways to process it after all these years. Because how do you handle something like this? Something that you're told your whole life doesn't exist, and then turns out to be true. So, I came across this subreddit based on the unexplained sightings and experiences when something happened with me that left me quite disturbed. I began to look it up on the internet, and I found a lot of the nighttime. Isolated accounts quite similar to what I had experienced just several weeks back. And it went something like this. Born and raised in Missouri, and I've always wanted to get a dog ever since I was little, but I couldn't get one. My mother was asthmatic, and my dad had a severe allergy to dogs. I moved out a few weeks ago and found myself a really great apartment, a room that I share with one of my friends. I had no intention of adopting a dog yet, but my friend, who's also my roommate, so I'll call him roommate in the story to avoid any confusion. He brought a few months old puppy with him one day. It was the most adorable thing I'd ever seen. The pupper looked like a mixed breed of German Shepherd and Border Collie. It was sleeping in my roommate's arms. I asked him if it was his. Much to my surprise, He told me that on his way back home, a car had hit its mother and the pupper was left behind. Since my roommate felt bad about it because he knew of my love for dogs, he brought it home for me. I was of course sad about the puppy, but at the same time, I was overjoyed at the fact that I could finally have a dog. I'm not really a morning person, so I try and sleep in for as long as I can before absolutely needing to get up out of bed. Getting a dog meant that I had to walk it out too. His name is Archie, by the way. The first week, Archie licked my face clean and would not stop unless I was out of bed. So what I found as a solution was that I walked Archie twice in 24 hours, once in the morning and once at night, so he wouldn't insist on going out so early in the morning. And it surprisingly has been working out quite well. A few days ago, when I was taking Archie out on a walk, there's a quiet, spooky cemetery we passed by. It has tall, creepy, incredibly dense trees. There's a footpath on the side. Then there's a road next to it, and then there are dense bushes on the other side of the road as well. We always walk on the footpath that's closer to the bushes, so the cemetery is on the far side of the road. We were walking there, and absolutely no noise around us. We try to be quiet as well so we don't disturb our neighbors. Archie and I start to walk past the cemetery when we hear a very loud rustling in one of the trees in the cemetery. Archie and I both stop and stare. The rustling and noise was too small to be that of an owl's or a bird's. Archie hid behind my legs and whimpered while I had my eyes glued the entire time at the tree, trying to find out exactly what it was. Then, I see a big shadow walk past, quickly, from a branch, towards the trunk of one of the trees. I could tell from that silhouette that it was illuminated by the full moon that night. I was scared, but I still wanted to know what the heck was jumping trees and who was doing it. I stayed rooted to the spot. It wasn't until I saw the figure crawl down the tree and fall with a loud thud in the bushes beneath. By that time, I had gotten the chills so bad, and my body was violently shaking. I no longer had an interest in finding out who or what it was, but I could not move. It was like something kept me there in my place. I heard the rustling get closer as the thing, whatever it was, ran out of the cemetery, crawling on all fours, crossing the road only to disappear in the bushes on my side. That was it. I grabbed my dog in my arms, running in the opposite direction as fast as I could. I kept looking back to see if the crawler thing was following me, and my heart almost stopped. I noticed it was. All I could see was reflective eyes and a creepy thing trying to catch up to me. Instinctively, I unbuckled Archie's collar, threw it back to him to aim at this crawler, but I didn't know if it hit him or not. I didn't turn around and keep running, going around corners. I stopped hearing the sound of steps behind me, after which I glanced back to check if it had finally given up, and I was so glad it wasn't there anymore. Without stopping to catch my breath, I still did not stop running the entire time, and took the longer route back to my apartment, which took like 15 more minutes of running. When I entered and slammed the door behind me, my roommate woke up from the noise, asking me what the matter was, since he saw the state I was in. I told him about the crawler. It didn't look like he believed me, but he agreed that he had heard of weird things from the cemetery and sightings nearby at night. He also said he always found it spooky, and what I saw could be an animal that was a false consolation. We both knew there's a city after a city where I live with no forest or trees or wild area or any sort of thing from where that thing could have came from. I know Missouri is wild, but I never knew it had things like this in it. Maybe I should move states. I was 18 at the time, and one day, I decided to go hunting. I had my shotgun and a bag of shells with me. I shot at a few birds and rabbits here and there. I was in the middle of the woods by myself, and I was about to pack it in, when I heard some strange rustling from the bushes. I then caught a glimpse of what I thought was a Dogman. It appeared roughly 7 feet tall and had a dog-like face with really long hair. It also had a long tail, like that of a wolf. I began to panic and I pointed my gun at the creature. I shot at it, and it let out a high-pitched scream. I then ran as fast as I could. It didn't chase me until I ran back to my truck, though. I got into my truck and started it. Then I drove off. I went home and never told anybody about it. I believe that dogmen are more common than people even realize. I don't know what the dogman wanted, but I'm terrified and I don't think I will go back to those woods hunting ever again. I knew all about dogmen originally because my uncle has had several encounters with them, so I'm familiar with the concept and what they look like. I never thought, though, in a million years I would ever run into one myself. I'm glad that I wrote down my encounter. It's nice to know that I'm not the only person in the world that has ever actually seen one. I mean, hell, before this, I thought I would never see one. But I guess I'm wrong. In 1991, I was lucky enough to be able to take a trip to Europe with my parents. I was very young at this time, but I still remember some of the things that had happened. I was staying in a hotel in London, England, and I was in my own room, lying in bed, looking out the window. The window was open. I wanted to go to sleep, but I kept hearing a sound outside, a sound that kept drawing my attention. It was a sound that was a mix of a squeal and a gurgle. I remember that it was coming from somewhere in the air over the nearby street. So I kept looking out the window to try and find a source, and I see a shadow pass over the street. I looked up to see that it was indeed looked like a gargoyle. It was a little over a few feet tall and appeared to have bat-like wings and almost a black beak-shaped like object on its face. It had a long spaded tail. It appeared dark, smoky gray in color, and it was flying straight towards me in the window. I remember that it got so close, I could see vivid detail in its face. It had yellow eyes with dark gray, black metal slanted pupils in each eye. It also had dark gray lips and humanistic features. It even had kind of pointed ears like that you would see devils have. It had a mouth that was wide open, revealing several rows of tiny pointed teeth, kind of like how fish have. And it was making this awful squeal as it came towards me flying. Now, this was kind of closer to night, so there wasn't a whole lot of light out, but light enough that the buildings were emanating light that I could see this thing. It was going to fly straight towards the glass and come into my room. I remember that I was extremely frightened. I screamed at the top of my voice. It flew right past the window, dodging us. I remember that it was so close to the glass, I even saw its reflection. I remember that there was a flash of white light behind it as soon as it followed. I remember that it flew right past the window, over the street, over to some other buildings, and finally disappeared. I closed the window so quickly and was so frightened that I cried myself to sleep that night. Of course, my parents were rich, so they had their own room and thought I would benefit at the age of 7 of me having my own. So I was all alone. The next morning, I was still upset and I told my parents about what I had seen, and then I told them that I had seen a gargoyle. They found it very odd and they did not believe me. They kept asking me what I was doing out of bed. I told them that I had heard the sound and I saw this thing that I thought was a gargoyle. They told me it was probably a dream, but I knew it was not a dream. It was all very real. It happened, and I have never been able to forget. In fact, I'm still afraid of gargoyles. I keep using the term gargoyle because I'm not sure what else to call them. It was some demonic humanoid. That's all I know how to describe it as, and I remember, even at that age, it scared me badly. One night, when I was in the Navy, back in 1982 or 1983, I was on night watch. I was stationed in the Persian Gulf. On that night, I was standing watch as the quartermaster, and I was on the starboard bridge wing, looking at the horizon. There were about 6 of us on watch, and the sky was extremely clear. It was a moonless night. The stars were very bright, and the sea was very calm. Up ahead of us, I saw a very bright light rising up out of the sea. It was not a plane. It was very bright. I could not tell if it was the reflection of the moon or a star, but I was so fascinated by this light that I wanted to see where it was coming from. I kept looking, and I saw the light get bigger, and I could tell it was coming from underneath the water. Some very large object was rising from the water, emanating a very low blue-colored light. It was then that I noticed it was a round object, maybe about 100 or so feet in diameter, and it was rising very slowly out of the sea. It was big, and very dark in the center, like a black shadow. Only the light of the stars reflected on it, and it itself emitted light, if that makes any sense. I watched it rise from the sea for about 10 or 15 minutes as it slowly ascended into the sky. Did I mention how round it was? And it was so large that I could see it, even when I turned my head. I remember that I was so fascinated, I forgot to even call the captain. I only remembered to tell the bridge watch standard to inform the captain when it reached its highest point. I watched it rise up over the horizon. It rose up and then just stopped and disappeared, before hanging out in the air, all the while making a very low humming sound. It was about 100 or so feet up in the sky, out of the sea, before I heard it disappear. I watched for about a few more minutes afterwards, waiting for this thing to appear again in the sky. I was in so much amazement and terrified at the same time, holding on to the platform railing. I could not believe what I was seeing. So I told others, "Guys, you gotta see this." They came out and stood beside me to watch it. All of us had seen it. I mean, it was so big, how could you not have seen it? I mean, none of us missed it. I remember talking to everybody afterwards, and we were all very quiet. Nobody spoke. It was just hanging there in the air. And then suddenly, when it went away, we were all kind of expecting it to return. But instead, it just disappeared. I remember that it was so fast that none of us could even imagine it would have gone. I was also scared to tell the captain, and scared to sleep for about the next week. But when I finally told the captain, he had told me that, well, there were other ships in the area that thought that it was some kind of secret experimental UFO craft. I didn't buy the explanation. We all believed that we saw a UFO. I mean, I don't know what else to call it. I have no idea what it was, but I am positive that it was not a military craft or a plane of any kind. Here's my story. It happened when I was about 4 or 5. I am now 30. I was living in an apartment complex here in St. Louis. I had an apartment facing a playground, so I would always be out there playing. One night, I was sitting out there and it was now getting pretty dark. I was the only kid out there at the time. And I see this creature come out of the woods. It was human-like, but I remember thinking even at that age it was not a human. It had a beak, and was all black, and kind of slithered in its movements. It was so tall that it easily was able to leap over the fence into the playground. It walked around, away from me, and I just had the feeling it was looking for somebody, or looking for me. I remember thinking I had to run. So, at 4 or 5, you can imagine how terrified I was when I ran inside and woke up my mom. I told her that I had not just seen a monster outside, but that it was coming for me. I don't remember if I told her what it was or not. Maybe I told her it was a goblin. But I do remember that it scared her. She made me go back out there with her, and she told me that there was nothing out there, and that I made her get up for nothing. So I got scolded for making things up. I remember thinking, though, that it was still there, that it was just hiding, waiting for her to leave so it can come looking for me. And I was still terrified. But after that, I stayed out of that playground for quite a while. The creature looked like some strange mix between a carnivorous bird like a vulture and a human, or something. I just remember thinking at 4 or 5 years old how ugly it was, and being at that age, how scared I was. Look, I really don't have an explanation for where it came from or why it exists, but I do believe that this thing is out there still, and there might be more of them. I have to live with this memory now forever, and I am a firm believer in things that are not supposed to exist, but do. I'm a believer because I myself had this experience. In 2000, while driving home from work at Mineral, Idaho, which is about 70 miles southwest of Salt Lake City, I came over the hill just east of Parawuna Pass, going around 10 p.m. at night. Looking south from this point, the road drops suddenly into Bonneville Salt Flats. On the road right below me, there were these 6 humanoids running down the road shoulder to shoulder. They were all very tall and thin, with long black hair and pointed ears. Each appeared to be wearing tattered robes. They moved quickly. Out of freaked curiosity, I began to slow down and watch them to try and get a better look, when I suddenly see one of these things turn and look right at me. And then slowly, all of them very slowly turned and faced me directly. We were still 30 to 50 feet away from each other. Now I'm very creeped out, and so I floored it, made the turn, and never looked back. It was a while before I ever told my son and others about what I saw. And finally, years later, I felt enough courage to share my experience on Facebook. My cousin, who lives 14 miles south of the pass, interviewed her elderly neighbor about werewolves spending time in the area, since they firmly believe that there are werewolf creatures out there. The neighbor said they chased her in the mountains when she was young, killed her friend, stole her family's animals, but never admitted it to the police because the dog befriended one of these creatures who ran off. She said most farmers around there had a greyhound because these creatures were always stalking and looking for more prey. But apparently, these greyhound dogs would keep these creatures at bay. You could still hear them howling some nights. Well, about 30 years prior, while on an evening deer run, I was out with my kids and came across a fresh kill in the sagebrush. This kill was torn into pieces, shredded like cheese. So, either there are some sort of wolf-like creatures walking around, or maybe there's truth to these Skinwalker shapeshifter beings out here in the desert. One thing is for sure, you have to be careful out here. It can get very dangerous, and if you are not prepared, well, prepare for bad things to happen. Before I end this email, I'll tell you about one quick encounter I remember one of my family members telling me about, at least that they thought there was a large coyote walking around their house at night. One night, my family member was actually out on her porch and said that the coyote thing was following her and their small dogs. She got scared, ran into the house, and so after wandering around some more, this thing, what she thought was an upright coyote, just ups and leaves. One of our other relatives had hunted in New Mexico for coyotes before, and he came and visited with her and said he was very familiar with this kind of evil spirit, and told her he could sense its presence all around her trailer and all over the land they lived on, that this being had purposefully left its mark there to let others know not to come here. Really scary stuff, honestly. When I was 16 years old, I was living in a small town called Mountain View, Arkansas, in a small house that my mother and I had rented. I was up late one night and I was all alone. I was going to bed and I heard a noise coming from the backyard. I went to check it out and saw this black figure walking towards the house from the woodline. It appeared to be about 7 feet tall with a long, curved beak face and large, glowing yellow eyes. It had bat-like wings on the back and large talon-like claws. Terrified, I ran back inside, locking the door. I wish I would have had a camera or cell phone to take a picture, but it was like 2004, so I didn't have a cell phone yet. I'm not sure what it was, a demon or a bat creature or what. I think it maybe might have been a demon, maybe a gargoyle.
but I'm not sure. This wouldn't be the first time, though, that something strange and I had run in together. I have had many paranormal experiences. The two that stand out the most are just before this sighting occurred. I was still 16 years old at the time, and I was home alone, and I was asleep. I woke up to see a black silhouette figure standing over me. But this figure wasn't an average-sized man. It was about 7 to 8 feet tall and had only what I can describe to you as burning red eyes that were filled with hate and malice, like it wanted to torment me and hurt me physically in any way it could. It was just radiating this aura off of it. You know how you can get a sense for good and bad people? Well, this thing was just giving off a really bad aura. And I tried screaming, but my body would not let me. I was paralyzed and I tried moving, but I could not. I was so scared. The figure just stared at me, and then it disappeared. I wasn't able to move for another few minutes, and when I could, I was terrified and freaked out. I did not even feel my legs. I felt like I was going to pee my pants. I just wanted to curl up in a ball and cry, but I could not. I was too scared to even do that. Eventually, I fell asleep, but couldn't wait to tell my mom about what had happened. She believed me, thankfully. I guess, come to find out, that she had a heaping helping of crazy things happen to her too, while she was in the same house. From seeing spirits, to seeing what she described to me as little imp-like creatures that tried to torture her early in the morning by prodding her with what she tells me is sharp objects. She never specified what she meant by that. I was young, so I didn't know what to do. I started praying that night, and the next day, I went to the library and really started reading the Bible. I read it and began to pray a little more. I still prayed and read the Bible like every day for a while, and it definitely seemed to help. I don't want to say I was religious or anything, but I had an understanding of the spirituality of it. I mean, I did have a lot of experiences with spirits and angels from my dreams and meditations. I definitely wasn't as scared as I was before, but I knew that something just wasn't right. I began practicing yoga and meditation shortly thereafter, and that felt like it was helping. Encounters at that point seemed to really come to a slowdown, and same with my mother. This was all shortly before we saw this physical entity, what I would describe as a gargoyle-like bat creature, and it had a beak and these nasty, hideous features. So maybe not that. Part of me believes it was the evil of this house that was allowed to manifest into a physical form to come after me, because I had been doing something right by praying, and I guess it did not like that. Then, fast forward more. After my sighting of this thing and how terrifying it was, I find out my mom had been seeing what she tells me are goblins. They're these hideous little creatures, maybe 2 to 3 feet tall, the size of a toddler, walking around her room at night. She'll wake up to them holding her down, trying to have their way with her, biting her, telling her they're going to kill her. Just really horrible stuff. Anyway, we put up with this stuff for about another year, off and on before we finally ended up moving. I remember because it was right at my senior year of high school when we moved out of that house. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. I've always believed that there is good and evil in the world, and I don't believe the devil is always going to be the one to come out the winner. I think God and the angels or the spirit realm are much, much stronger, and I believe if you have enough faith and you're open to the experience, then you can definitely see the other side. I don't think it's something that happens all the time, but I think you can experience it if you want to put the effort in. Now, I don't want to give out the details of the place we moved afterwards because I'm unsure of the location to be exact, but I'll just say this, it was much closer to town. Hi, what lurks beneath? I know this isn't a normal story email that you're so accustomed to getting, but I found this article and I think you can appreciate it. I'm sure if you read it, your viewers can too. Here it is. Encounters with Dogman have been reported for years around the world, but in Scandinavia, they've been chronicled for as long as documented records have been kept. Jens Lekman has studied the Dogman, performing a statistical assessment on newspaper and folklore archives to identify areas where they have been seen. He also looked at ecosystems and demographics in a study intended to prove or falsify the Dogman. By diachronic measurements, sightings have occurred mostly in the fall, with numbers peaking in October. The most frequently reported times are around 4 p.m. to 4 a.m. The size of the creatures, according to Lekman, range from 2 to 3 meters, and they are less commonly sighted near water. One distinguishing characteristic that makes the Dogman stand out from a common dog is a prolonged tail, facial features such as pointed ears, and the defining factor of a creature being half man and half dog. However, a lot of it is also behavior. Local lore liken the creature to attack on livestock, horses, cows, and sheep. The local river may have been polluted because of large amounts of blood in the water by locals at one point hundreds of years ago. But the watershed for that river shows a large amount of white-tailed deer activity, giving the Dogman ample food opportunities. The animal most likely to attack livestock would be a stray wolf. Are wolves responsible for these sightings? They are territorial animals. Human activity gives them an even greater sense of urgency. Lekman suggests that human encroachment is of importance when evaluating the behavior of these creatures, and he says this: I ruled out the idea of the Dogman is a dog-wolf hybrid. I found it quite odd that these things occurring in the northernmost areas of Sweden, such as dogs being found decapitated. Several hunters reported not seeing deer, even in their designated hunting areas. Other reports of strange footprints in snow have been dismissed as bear trails, even when tracks don't belong to any Russian or polar bear found in Sweden. Lekman suggests that, in some instances, the creature may be more human-like, but he cannot narrow down a specific description. Many creatures described by eyewitness reports could be considered humanoid bipedal animals, which occur quite often throughout history and have even been associated with the paranormal. At least one other researcher suggests it may be more of a problem with misidentification than something paranormal. Cryptozoologist Johan Randwall contested Lekman's claim that these creatures could not be a dog and wolf crossbreed. It's known that animals can become fixed in certain inbred or regionalized structures, like many domestic dogs, but the facts still prove that crossbreeds are not a common thing, and not only must be two species. Coyotes and dogs look more like dogmen than, for instance, a bottlenose dolphin. Considering that forming hybrid species is thousands or even millions of years old, to place a doubt over a well-insured claim doesn't hold much water. Perhaps this serves as a warning if you request people moving to rural areas to not further overpopulate the landscape. Regardless, whether these are really dogmen or not something is occurring in the region for people to be so interested in. I was crossing railroad tracks when I looked up, and I caught my first glimpse ever of a cryptid. It was a wolf, peering through trees on my left. I briefly caught my second visual, this time straight on, of the same creature crouched, looking at me. There was a sudden blur of motion, and this wolf was running toward me. I hardly had enough time to think, and so I ran to my left. I turned around just in time to see this thing running toward me, and this thing was pursuing me hot on two legs, the same way an Olympic runner would run directly at you. Unrelenting, I held my breath and dove into a small pond that was right near me, hoping that this would deter this thing from chasing me. I know it sounds strange, but when you're in fight or flight mode, you do some questionable things. This thing stops and hesitates, unsure of what to do next. I stayed below the surface of the pond, trying my best to hold my breath and to not surface. All I could see was the faint outline of this thing just standing there, waiting for me to surface. The thought of what was chasing me 2 seconds ago, then not doing anything, made me really question my reality. I waited for almost 2 minutes before I felt my lungs about to burst, and as I came to the surface, this thing was now completely out of sight. After looking around, I couldn't see it, but man oh man, I could feel it. I just felt this heavy presence, this lingering feeling looming in the area and I knew it had to be close by. I knew if I did not act now, I was getting out of here alive. So I quickly pulled myself to shore and made a break for it. Immediately, I hear this thing bursting out of the bushes and starts pursuing me yet again. I'm really not sure, looking back, why a mere pond and me being submerged in water, with it having anything to do with it stopping to chase me. Maybe it knew I was hiding, so it too took the chance to also hide and wait for me. What I can tell you is patience is virtue. I must have been a thorn in its proverbial side. Something made this thing tire of me quickly, because it gave up on me as a meal and left. I gave myself a fair distance of space and waited for what seemed to be the right moment to give my legs enough freedom to start running again. I was still tucked in behind a few trees, just trying to catch my breath. It was then that I heard that sound of these wolves' claws pushing against the soil, these thudding of their legs coming towards me. It was coming back again. I knew I could not wait around. I could hear it coming back, unsure of what to do exactly. I peeked out behind a large tree in concealment as this thing was sprinting towards me again, knocking a massive tree down as it went. All I could think of was if it gets any closer, I'm a goner. No one to stand witness but me and the animal's next meal. This thing didn't stop. It was fixated on bringing harm to me and killing me. As it furled down to make another leap, all I could think of was, God, please let it fall. Leave me be. Those prayers must have been answered, as this blur's body fell into a softer, overgrown area behind me, in the earth. I turned around to see this creature falling down into this small pit, covered in mulch and pine and tree limbs. Immediately, I began retreating back the way I came. I picked up my pace and did not stop running until I was safely in my car. I could hear this thing screaming and howling the entire way, pissed that it had lost me. Whatever it was some unknown creature with an ape-like body shape, connected to the deaths of two people affiliated with the same people connected with the first death of a professor and a student. Someone took pictures of film associated with the deaths. I knew my friend who was working with them back in the woods in 1964. There's something going on, and it's important for somebody to finally find out and really expose what's going on here. I am of high moral standard, and personally, with a deep understanding of the spiritual world. Too much to explain here in the small email, so I'll cut to the chase. This is my eyewitness encounter of this hominid creature. May 6th, 2017. I was finishing my loop around as I was walking home from the market, where I had just finished doing errands. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement in a nearby tree. Upon looking, there was my first great sighting. This humanoid monkey-like creature swung down between the branches, as if weightless, and then dropped down very quickly, disappearing behind the tree. The creature crouched at first and was swaying side to side, all while staring at me. It appeared weightless, like I said. Once I saw it smoothly sit on the limb, it immediately leapt away and vanished. The drop was fascinating and quick. I don't know if it was followed or chased by something bigger, but I assume it was not alone. There was no repeated sighting, and no real noise accompanied this sighting, so I'm not sure. Another interesting thing too was I could see, at least I thought, was another figure at my peripheral on my left as I was walking too. Once I look over though, it was always gone. I'm not sure how to describe such a strange creature. However, I do know for me personally, it is something I will never forget. I only saw it for a brief moment, and have even questioned myself, but it happened. This was my second encounter up to this point, as a few weeks ago, I experienced something brush past my legs in my sleep, and I felt its physical presence bruise me while in a deep trance-like state. I believe the reoccurring sightings I have of the same type of being or beings is of high spiritual importance. Having this encounter, I have since relocated to Mesa, Arizona back in February, and I'm keeping my eye out for what may be more of these things. I was out camping one evening by a large lake, all by myself. The night was beautiful, and it was a serene, quiet evening. All of a sudden, I felt this breeze of extremely cold air, and a presence walking up beside me, but I saw nothing. As I feel the presence draw closer, I could hear the noise of heavy breathing. I assumed it was a bear, and I turned on my flashlight to look around. I didn't see anything, but I could feel something. I could hear breathing, but there was no signs of anything near me. Completely unnerved by this newfound sighting or experience, I sat up and decided it was time to retire to my tent. I quickly jumped in, afraid of what was going to happen. I stayed in my tent the rest of the night, clutching hold of my flashlight and a tiny pocket knife should anything happen. Attempting to calm myself, I distracted myself with thoughts of remembering camping as a child. Then, I heard two loud screeches just outside my tent. Then nothing. Shortly thereafter, I started hearing these loud noises approaching my tent in the night. They sounded large, and whatever it was that I was hearing. I was panicking, thinking two really large men were going to come, invade, and kill me. The sounds would stop abruptly just outside my tent, then walk away and return at another angle. Several times this went on. I could hear 3 separate footsteps and sounds. The whole encounter lasted for several hours. It felt like an eternity. I thought I was going crazy. I just wanted it to stop. There were all sorts of other strange noises. Some of them were screams and growls, while the others were strange stomping noises. Then it would go silent for a moment, and I hear what sounded like a large branch being ripped off a tree right by me. Then, I hear it getting kicked off into the forest. Now, not only was I scared because of what I was experiencing, but I felt like whatever this was is trying to intimidate me and wanting to hurt me. Finally, it stopped, and I could not keep it together. I tried calling out for help, just hoping somebody else was around, but I heard nothing but me. I felt as though I was completely helpless and all alone. I knew I was doomed. This had been going on for hours now at this point, and these things were coming back and forth around my campsite. They were always circling my tent. It's like they were waiting for the right moment to strike. You could imagine I was on edge like crazy. And finally, the noises eventually ceased for a period of time. I wasn't sure what was going to happen. They could still be out there watching me, but I was not going to take any chances or risks. I figured that staying put in my tent was the best course of action, at least until sunrise. I waited out the entire night in my tent, completely frozen in fear. Morning eventually came, and I had not slept at all. Thoroughly exhausted, I decided to hike my way out as soon as I could. Upon exiting my tent, the area around me was trashed. Huge branches were ripped off the large fir tree, about 10 feet away from my tent. My supplies were thrown all over the campsite. Frightened but intrigued, I grabbed my stuff, hit the trail looking for a clear spot where I could escape, because I couldn't exactly remember the section of trail that I had hiked in. I only had the backpack that was salvageable, and of course my tent. Everything else outside was destroyed. Upon getting to my car more than just a mile away, I opened my trunk, put my gear inside. At the time, I had no idea what had happened the night before, but as I'm closing my trunk, getting ready to enter my car, I heard this horrific scream off in the distance. It sounded like a man's yell, but really deep and really loud. Like whatever made it had a huge set of lungs. I froze in place, listening for a few seconds. Then, out of nowhere, these strange noises start sounding off all around me. I felt immediate danger, and just like the night before, I realized if I didn't get in my car at that very moment, my life would be in danger. Terrified, I jumped in my car, locked all the doors, and left as fast as I could. Still hearing these noises echoing off in the distance. What did I hear the previous night? What did all of this mean? All I can say is that this experience left me completely overcome with fear, confusion, and amazement. I've never had an experience like that before. I still feel shaken about how such a large creature could move about at night, surround a tent like it did, and scare somebody, yet without ever being seen. There are theories and explanations for what it could have been, but I really have my doubts about most of them. I just don't think everybody has come up yet with a plausible answer. You have to be aware that how loud these were, intimidating and ferocious these things were. Whatever it was, I'm certain it's not a bear. Is it possible I encountered a Bigfoot? I was working a late-night shift at a meat processing plant. My coworker and friend Sean and I were smoking a cigarette outside on break and just chatting away by our car when we hear something off in the trees right beside the parking lot. It naturally distracts us, and we both turn our attention to what we just heard. I mean, it was pretty loud. All we could make out afterwards was a rustling of something big moving and some very faint breathing sounds, like somebody who smoked a pack a day their entire life. Incredibly raspy. We both give each other glances of puzzlement, figuring somebody was just maybe messing with us, or maybe it was a homeless person. It was very weird. I mean, nobody could get in there. There's industrial barbed wire fencing, and beyond the fencing was trees. The surrounding area was just thick woods that connected to a national forest, I believe. So, after glancing for maybe 5 or so more seconds, we're both just like, huh, and we go back to chit-chatting. Then the next thing you know, we hear this loud crunch of a tree branch, followed by even more rapid deep breathing. We turn our attention again, and this time, we glance towards the side of the trees and we see a thing. I say thing because I don't know what it was, but it was hunched over and then stood up to its full height. Sean and I both saw it, and Sean was so shocked he drops his cigarette. This thing was a large hairy creature, and might I add how ugly it was. It also appeared to have a snout and had deep set-in eyes. This thing was well over 6 feet tall, maybe no more than 8 or 9 feet. It was pretty tall. It had kind of grayish black fur, and the more we saw its face, the more hideous it was. To better explain what it looked like, imagine orangutan, or Alf, if you remember Alf. It was like a monkey crossed with a wolf. It was just ugly. It had some more human-like traits, while others were more canine-like. I remember 2 large rows of pointed teeth. It too had a very wide snout. I guess think like Alf, but add some canine features to it, and make it a little bit more scary looking. It slowly bent down, looked up at us, and stood up right away against the fencing, staring at us. It just glared, and after a couple more moments, it turned away and went back into the trees. I looked at Sean, and he looked at me. He was terrified, and we used this as an opportunity to run back inside and end our break. We told our boss and other coworkers nothing. We finished out our shifts terrified out of our minds that we saw this thing. After work, Sean and I would only talk about it briefly, that we never saw anything like it before, and nobody would ever believe us, even if we did tell somebody. We talk to each other once in a while about it, but not really. I mean, we generally don't mention what we saw, and especially to anybody else. We do still hang out on break and talk about things like we normally did, but not like this. I don't think we'll ever be as comfortable as we were. The sighting has kind of changed us. I'm really not sure what we saw that evening. Maybe you could help me out. My daughter, 12 years old at the time, had stayed overnight with me, and we had fallen asleep on the living room couch. We awoke around 7:15 a.m. to see this entity standing by the window. The first thing I noticed immediately was hair hanging down over its face and down the back of its head and neck. It was weird looking. It was covered in nasty matted hair and looked like an ugly dog. It was staring at us. I felt like I was paralyzed and could not get up off the couch. I was petrified, to say the least. We had a staring competition for what seemed like forever, and I finally was able to scream. And just before it turned and walked away, my daughter had awakened and seen this thing too. She immediately became hysterical. She runs up to me and collapses on me crying. I phoned the police after it walked away, but they told me there was really nothing they can do about it. Well, a couple of nights later, and we had completely forgotten all about the whole thing. My daughter's father had come pick her up for the weekend, and as he's getting her into his truck, I hear him start yelling, just as I got back in the house. I go back outside and I see this thing, the same thing we saw last night approaching my now ex-husband and daughter. I froze again and could not get my body into gear. I was so terrified I couldn't even move. My ex-husband pulls out his pistol and fires at it, hitting it in the chest. But the thing never flinched. It just kept coming. Eventually, it turned and began to walk off. He shot at it again in the back, but again, it didn't even flinch. It just walked off, up and over up a hill. It never even stopped. The man always keeps a firearm on him, and I'm glad he did because who knows what this thing would have done had he not had a weapon. What I can't believe is that he shot it, and this thing didn't even react. It was just evil. So he's flipping out, asking me if I saw that, and I start to tell him about how we just saw it at the window the other night. I asked him to follow me up into the house so I could show him what the situation and where I was when we had seen it. I showed him, and we exited the house, and he goes around and looks, and you could see, which I didn't see, but there were impressions in the ground where this thing had been clearly standing. He seemed quite shocked, but at the same time, he seemed like he knew what he'd been seeing that night. There wasn't any feet prints, but you could just see something big and heavy had been standing here, right in front of our window. I shudder at the thought that this thing could have been there for a while, watching us sleep before we even awoke to see it. For the next 4 to 5 months, we had weird sensations all around the house and property, feeling like we're either not alone or being watched. But to us, we never did see that thing again after that. My ex-husband, after that, always brought around his 44 with him. At that point, every time he came to pick up and drop off our daughter, never did have an experience like that again for the remainder of the time that I lived in that house. This was in May of 1985, and I moved out of that house shortly after, Thanksgiving of the same year. Lately, all of the animals in our neighborhood have started to act strangely. We can attribute these behaviors to none other than supernatural forces. At random times, all of our animals will begin to act strangely, barking, hissing, and acting crazy at the woods surrounding our houses. Our cats recently have gone missing, and so have our small dogs, while some of us believe that it's a pack of coyotes or something on the loose. I know better. Whatever is there has taken an interest in our pets for reasons still unknown. If this is in fact paranormal, entering an aggressive, directly territorial combat response is illogical, as in nature. Defense-based aggression is rarely the first response. Based on the research, I believe that this is a being that is purposefully waiting for just the right moments to strike. They know, or it knows how we behave, yet we do not know its behaviors. It's extremely patient, cunning, and intelligent. It's not a coyote, fox, or wolf. I've seen the wanderings of coyotes, and there appears to be a kind of intelligent guiding in their behavior. Based on emotional interference and drawing from memory, coyotes, even in packs, seem apprehensive when coming into certain territories of neighborhoods, due to large populations. We live in areas with a lot of wildlife and birds anyway, so it's very natural to assume that coyote behavior is simple fear of human beings. These cats, though, that are being snatched away and small dogs aren't animals straying far away from populated areas in the neighborhood. They're being snatched up from the yards or back porch. Something is taking them, and nobody is sure what it is. From other experiences alone in the woods, we know it's not your typical animal in nature. This has to be the work of something else entirely. What? I'm not quite sure. Is it possible that this is a Dogman or Bigfoot? Absolutely, since they are usually the ones to be a little bit more aggressive when it's coming in for food and based on stories and other experiences. But at what scale do we really call this a Dogman or Squatch? How many animals have to disappear? This has to be something else that we are not experiencing or understanding. What is creepy is that this is going on mostly at night, when everybody's asleep, in the early morning hours. That's when these animals are disappearing and nobody is finding a single trace of them. My girlfriend, in fact, asked me one night if I saw movement out in the yard, but I didn't see what she was talking about. She shot up out of bed to look and said she could have sworn she saw a big shadow moving around quickly between yards. But I dismissed her outright. And it's really got me thinking. Maybe there is truth to what she had to say. So far, nobody has found a trace of any animals, no blood trails, no clues, and never any bones. I do think we will find the remains at some point, but who knows? I honestly have no idea.
So this just happened. I am with a friend in a cabin, with my boyfriend, seeing our goddaughter. She was born back in March, but due to the pandemic, we have just been able to visit them. But that's besides the point. I was out back with their dog Jojo, who is a pit bull, and, by the way, the sweetest dog I have ever met. We were playing fetch, and about 30 minutes before I actually saw anything, I had this odor hit my nostrils. Rotting flesh. I didn't worry too much because we were pretty high up in the mountains. I thought maybe it had just been a dead deer from the way up on the hills, and the smell was just now getting to me. So, I continued to play with Jojo, and once he was content, chewing his stick, I sat down on a log and just enjoyed the sound of my music and the stars above. I could still smell the rotting scent, but I brushed it off. So 5 minutes go by, and I get this really odd feeling of being watched. Jojo, his ears perk up, and he looks around like he's heard something. Now, I did have my headphones on, listening to some music, so I didn't really hear much. But I looked around to one of the trees, and the white flash went quickly. I get up, call Jojo over to my side, like the big coward he is, rushed to me, tail between his legs. We stood there for a second, and the smell at this point was so strong, I wanted to gag. For a second, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then it peeled at me from behind the trees. I only had to look at it for about 4 seconds before I ran the hell away. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, skinny, huge, and black eyes. Kind of long blonde hair, too. I'm telling you now, I had never been so scared in my life. I was about 20 or so feet away from the porch, and I floored Jojo in tow, and we did not look back. We get into the house, and I told everybody what happened. My boyfriend thinks I was just saying things, and, of course, so did my friends. But they did say they had never seen Jojo so spooked, and she is now hiding under my goddaughter crib. I'm not a joke as I'm writing all this. We had just heard a scream of a man. We are the one in at least a 30-mile radius. So please, help me out here. I don't know much about these kinds of things other than the basic stuff. I'm still shaking. I'm 22 now, and this was back when I was 17, when I was still a junior in high school. One night, I had snuck out of my house without my parents knowing. I live in the basement level, so it's just a matter of climbing up on my table and sneaking out the floor window. It was about 12:30 at night, and I was heading over to my girlfriend's house, which is about 15 minutes away. A nice lengthy walk through kind of a parky, woodsy area, and then into another neighborhood. We were going to be teenagers. I'll leave your imagination up to that. Without making this email too vulgar, I climb up out of my window, and I'm on the road. And because it's 12:30 at night, it's just me. Because of the neighborhood I'm in, it's pretty dead. I mean, there's practically no traffic around at all. Nothing. And it's pretty quiet out too. Now, I don't remember hearing any crickets, but that could just be because it was one of those quieter nights. I don't know. I'm not sure if that has really anything to do with it, but either way. So I'm walking, and I get past the park area where it's a lot woodsier. To my left is this large open park. Back beyond the park is this thick wooded area, and there's trees all throughout the park, all throughout the woods, and even up by the sidewalk where I'm walking. If I were to look to my right, directly to the right of me is a street, and then beyond that is more neighborhood. Now I had to cross all the way around this park to get to the adjacent neighborhood, which is where my girlfriend's house was. Like I said, roughly 15 minutes away from my house, walking distance. So as I'm walking, I get right up to that park area, and I notice around me again that there's nobody around, except the streetlights are on, and maybe a car or two buzz by, but nothing really. And I get this strange feeling that somebody's looking at me. So I start to look around and figured maybe someone's just sitting in their car watching this 17-year-old boy with a backpack on walk by. But I looked and I didn't see anybody in their car. And actually, there weren't many cars around either. A few parked here and there, but nothing. So I kind of just shrugged off the feeling and kept walking. Then, directly off to my left, movement catches my eye. So I look over, and I see this large, tall black shape dart quickly from tree to tree. But this is way back beyond the park. Easily probably 100 or so feet back. But it was large enough that it caught my attention. I figured it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, and maybe just the time of night and whatnot. I keep walking, and I get about to the end where the park is. At least the corner where I have to turn to the left to get into the adjacent neighborhood, where my girlfriend lives. And out of the corner of my eye, just like before, there's no mistaking. I see movement, and this movement is this tall, large, black human shape, except it's running towards me. Full speed, like some sort of drugged homeless maniac. And as I go to look, I could see it sprinting towards me. Except it looked more like an animal than anything else, at least from what I saw. The shape was shaped like a human, but it had hair, at least that I could see. And so I just dropped my backpack and I started running as fast as I could, because I was loosely holding it on my shoulders. I made it to my girlfriend's house in double time, and never once looked back to see if I was still being followed. I don't think I was, because as soon as I ran into the neighborhood, I didn't hear it following behind me. But then again, I never heard its footsteps actually. My girlfriend thought it was awfully strange how panicked and out of breath I was, but I explained to her that some maniac meth head tried to rush me in the park. She was concerned, but ultimately glad I was okay. Although I don't think it was a maniac meth head, or anything like that, or even a homeless person. Whoever it was freakishly tall, and covered in hair. That much I did see, with the minimal lighting. What it was, or who it was, I don't know. But it freaked and creeped me out. The following account is 100% truthful, and took place at 3 in the morning, on October 31st, 2020. My friends and I always go on walks together past midnight. In the woods, along the roads, anything. We usually have 4 people, but this time, Ben, the guy whose house we were staying at, could have had 6 people over. So, the 6 of us walked along the road to this Verizon tower on this hill. The stars look very nice up there at night, so we always do it. We get about halfway up the hill, and we're kind of feeling uneasy. It's a full moon on Halloween night, after all. I mean, you can only imagine. Nick, the oldest and most stoic out of all of us, the one who never jokes or believes in the paranormal or anything, points his flashlight ahead on the trail. What is that? He also rarely swears, so this was another attention-grabbing thing. We all stop and look ahead. About 20 paces ahead of us, there it was. 8 feet tall, snow white, a skin and bone, lanky, bipedal thing within a stone's throw. 6 people all saw this at the same time. It takes off into the woods at superhuman speed. We stop and are silent for a moment. We immediately start asking if everybody saw it, and, of course, everybody did. Now we argue and cuss, and I try my hardest to convince the others to turn back and forget it. But fearless Ben, who doesn't believe in anything, begs to push on. We do. Now, I've cut down a lot of trees in my day, so I know what it sounds like when one falls. On the continuation of our voyage, less than a minute later, a tree slams to the ground on the side of the trail. It didn't fall. It was pulled down with force. We stop and argue. We push on. A minute after that, we hear a rustling and a loud, painful chirp from a bird. We make it to the tower and look around. The top of the hill is mostly devoid of trees, so we look down the path where it ran. Ben is still trying to convince us that he is not afraid. We decide to run the half-mile back down to his house. We get there, and now Ben starts crying. This is a guy who has never ever believed in anything his entire life. But he, out of everybody, saw something up there. We all did. I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes. We've gone back up there, but haven't seen anything since. And I've done a lot of research into it. I have no doubt in my mind what we saw was a Wendigo. First off, I'm going to say that I have been somewhat interested in this kind of stuff for quite some time, but I've always been pretty skeptical of most paranormal things, taking every story like this I hear with a grain of salt. Also, I have taken multiple camping trips to the Utah deserts, and this is the first time anything like this has happened to me. Yesterday, me and my 3 brothers went on a short one-night camping trip to the lava tubes near Fillmore, Utah, but pretty much in the middle of nowhere in the desert. We had a good evening hanging out and talking before watching the stars, a movie, and going to bed. We brought a 4-man tent and set up our campsite far from the dirt road. Even though we were the only people there, my brothers all fell asleep pretty quickly, though for some reason, I could not. So, I just listened to the coyotes howling in the distance for about an hour and a half. By now, it's about 12:30 or 1 a.m., and I'm still awake. Suddenly, I get this odd feeling, like the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and my gut sank at the same time. That's when I hear it. Someone or something was walking toward our campsite. At first, I thought it was just a coyote, but it sounded heavy, and its footsteps sounded bipedal. I could hear its feet sliding through the grass and shifting the stones on the ground as it was getting closer and closer to us, until the footsteps sounded like it was right beside our tent. I couldn't see it from where I was. Then, I heard a shrill, hollow, unearthly whistle coming from just outside the tent. I went stiff. My heart was racing. It sounded so unnatural and alien that I did not know how to react. I was just terrified. Finally, after a long minute of silence, I heard it slowly walk away. The same heavy footsteps until I could not hear it anymore. I was more scared than I have ever been in my life last night. I was too scared to take a peek outside the tent, but now I wish I kind of would have. I stayed awake for another hour, wondering if I should wake my brothers or not, but decided against it and tried to sleep. This morning, before we packed up and left, I told them what I had heard, but none of them really believed me until we made it back home and my dad told us something really unsettling. He said this, that last night, around 12:30, he felt super worried about us, and he didn't know why. He told us that we had this feeling like we were in severe danger and that he needed to pray for our protection, which he did immediately. Once my brothers heard him say that, they both took my story a little more seriously, but they are still skeptical, as am I. Look, I don't know what I heard last night, but I do know I heard something. If anybody has any ideas, please, I'd love to hear them. So, this is the first time that I've ever actually shared this story, and I often listen at night for bedtime stories. I consider this 100% true, and it takes place in Cincinnati, Ohio, specifically Claremont County. So we'll clear out some initial details. I'm a female, I'm 31 years young now, and this happened back in 2006. So at the time, I was 17, going on 18. My boyfriend, we will call M, my friend, who we will call A, and her boyfriend, now husband, we will call N, are the ones involved in this unexplained event. So, for some background info first, there's this abandoned cabin in the middle of the woods, and you can only get to it by walking roughly a mile one way. There are abandoned cars, an ambulance, some tractors, and other random vehicles like a short school bus. They're all covered in gunshots. There's not even a path to drive a vehicle back there. If there was, we would be walking a mile one way to get there. So, we're not sure how they even got there, or how long they've ever been there. My boyfriend and I had gone with 2 other friends previous to our encounter, and it was creepy, but not compared to what had happened when we went with A and N. So, on our previous trip, we went with our friends, T and J. T and myself went upstairs and had a Ouija board. We asked some random stupid questions. I can't even remember. What I do remember is it spelled out hooey, like H-O-O-E-Y. We said goodbye on the board, and I was looking around the upstairs, which was really just an attic. We found massive kids' socks in the wall. It was really random and weird. We got startled when an alarm clock began ticking. It would stop, so I smashed it to pieces, and that was that. We walked downstairs where the boys were and made our way back outside. We found a creepy old well that was covered up. Then, all of a sudden, we heard that alarm clock ticking again, but I know I had broken it, so that kind of spooked us, but nothing major. We saw an outdoor cellar we went in, and there was a Girl Scout's boot with a bone inside the shoe. So I was like, okay, we're done for the day. Let's go. So my boyfriend and myself were telling A and N about this cabin and what happened when T and J came with us. So we decided we were going to go later that day. So the day this encounter happened, M, N, A, and myself went to the lake, packed a cooler with the food and crap, and spent probably 5 or so hours at the lake, ate, and just hung out. We left the lake and stopped at A and N's house, dropped the cooler off, which was in the trunk of the car. This is important for later in the story. After getting everything out of the trunk from our lake trip, we headed to my boyfriend's parents' house, where we parked the car and began our hour walk. We had flashlights, and that was it. The walk there was pretty uneventful. We had to walk through 2 huge drainage tunnels just to get to this cabin. I mean, it was back there. So we make it there, and it wasn't dark out, but it seemed different this time. And I'm not really sure how to explain it. But it was just different, but we did come later in the day than previously. So I was like, okay, whatever. Just like last time, when we get inside, A and myself was going to go upstairs. I wanted to show her the socks on the wall, and I also wanted to check on the clock that I broke last visit, that I heard ticking outside previously. I'm sure you remember. As we start to go up the stairs, there was this big loud crash, like something was thrown or knocked over. A gets freaked out, and then out of nowhere, she books it outside back down to the creek, yelling at M and N and myself to come on. I go chasing after her, and she's now in tears, having a full-blown panic attack, saying something. Finally, I get that she saw someone looking in at us in the window. We tell the guys and literally nobody is around. Only the four of us. Since she's so distraught, we decide to go ahead and leave. So we're walking back down to the creek bed, heading back the same way we came, which is the only way there. M and N are kicking over these huge rocks. We stop and realize there are huge rocks, I'd say boulders, standing right up in a line the entire way down the creek bed. They couldn't have been there not even 20 minutes prior, because we would have noticed them as we were now. So this seriously freaked all of us out. This is not normal, and it was not natural. We pick up the pace and start to haul butt out of there. We make it to the first drainage tunnel and turn on our flashlights. Literally, none of them will even turn on. 4 flashlights that worked perfectly fine on the way there. Now, none of them work? What's happening? So, 30 minutes later, we're back at my boyfriend's parents' house, where A and N is parked. A gets in the car because, at this point, she's ready to go home, and nope, out of here. Forget this event ever happened. The rest of us are still outside the car. A suddenly gets out of the car, screaming and jumping up and down, flying around. She is covered in ants. We are like, what the actual hell is going on? So we look and they're coming from the back seat and from the trunk. And opens the trunk of his car, and laying in the trunk is this huge, rusty, extremely old wool sock covered in ants. Now, remember what I said earlier in the story. We had been in all out of the trunk all day, and there was nothing in the trunk when we left the house from dropping off the cooler. Now, there is a wool sock covered in ants that covered their car. This was too much for any of us to even wrap around our heads. Needless to say, we've never been back there, and I personally will never go back. So, it turns out, the man who used to live in that cabin was named Hubert, and he was often called Huey. My boyfriend had actually been to the cabin once before I ever went, and he found these journals there. The man was an alleged child molester. His journals went into detail about his urges, etc. I'm not going to go into that much detail, but again, this story is totally true, and it was honestly the one and only time I've ever encountered something like this. I will never go back to that cabin. Ever. Even to this day, talking about it right now, I have goosebumps. I can't explain what happened. I have no idea what I saw that scared her so badly in the window. But I do know this. Boulders do not stand straight up on their own in a line, and nobody could have done it so fast to scare us. Nobody could have messed with our flashlights, and nobody could have put that old, dirty, ant-infested wool sock in A&N's car trunk. If you are ever wandering through the woods and come across a random cabin, just leave it. You never know who lived there, what they did, and who or what might still be there. Unfortunately, I learned that the very hard and unsettling way. So, for starters, this was back in 2008, and I was leaving town headed east. At this time, I lived with my girlfriend out in Portland, Oregon, and I was heading east on Highway 84. This highway heads east and runs along what's called the Columbia Gorge, which separates Oregon and Washington state by a beautiful large river. It is easily one of the most gorgeous places to live, but cell phone coverage is pretty crappy, even nowadays. And right before I actually got on 84, I pulled off on one of the last, not pullouts, but it was like a ramp that led to a small road where there's kind of a parking lot, and there's a lot of trees all around. I wouldn't say forest, it was just an area where there was a lot of heavier woods, but it was right off the highway. So I take this off-ramp, pull off into this small parking lot, because I needed to call my girlfriend, and even though this wasn't in an area where cell phone service was bad, I could not get a call to go through. So I figured I would pull over, make a phone call, and get back on the road. No problems, right? Well, it wasn't that simple. So I pull over, and of course nobody is around, so I'm the only real witness here, I get out of the car to get some fresh air, pull up my old flip phone, like we had in 2008, because iPhones had just started to come out, and I start talking to my girlfriend. For the life of me, I can't quite remember what the conversation was about, but it's pretty irrelevant to the story. We're lost in conversation, talking about whatever it is we were talking about at the time, and I see something moving directly ahead of me in the woods. Or the trees, whatever you call it. And as I'm looking, I'm still in conversation. I see this hand kind of jet up and pull the branch down, and staring at me is this weird, freaky-looking face that I literally paused halfway into speaking a sentence to my girlfriend. And she's like, "Hello, are you still there?" And I was so shocked I couldn't even finish what I was saying. I'll try and describe the face for you as best as I can, but it's so weird, I don't even know what it could have been. Being up here in the Northwest, I've heard of Bigfoot, and even things like werewolves, I guess, but it didn't really look like either, and it did not match any descriptions of that of a bear either. Imagine elongated like a horse's face, but not that extreme. And its eyes were very sunken into its skull, but unlike a horse, they were not on the side of its head. They were forward-facing, and it kind of had a nose, kind of half-human, half-slits. It was more the lower part of the face and mouth that kind of drooped down. The skin appeared to be all black, and there was this thick, dark brown hair that was very wiry-looking, all around its head, and its skull, it seemed to be a little bit pointed, upwards. I didn't see any ears or anything else, but it had large gorilla-like hands. That much I do remember. As it was staring at me, I'll never forget what it did next. It kind of slowly lifted up its lips and smirked at me in some horrifying way. Then it kind of quickly ducked down and disappeared. All the while, I was still frozen on the phone with my girlfriend, not sure exactly what I should say. I just told her I needed to go, and I kind of just sat there for a moment, trying to process and render what I had just seen. What was it? I just got in the car and drove to where I was supposed to go, and I called my girlfriend later on that night, and was like, "Hey, I needed to tell you something. I saw something earlier while we were on the phone, and I'm not quite sure what it is." I was actually really distraught about the whole thing, but she's so awesome, she helped me look it up and find out what it could have been. Her first thought was that it was a Bigfoot, and she was pretty adamant that they don't exist, since she didn't believe in that kind of stuff, but she kept asking me from pictures, "Is this what you saw? Is this what you saw?" And yeah, some of them looked similar, but not quite what I had seen. What I saw looked different. It didn't look like a man or it didn't look like an ape. It looked like something else entirely. I do remember too, it had kind of glowing cat eyes. Maybe glowing is not the right word, but very bioluminescent in a way. Like they were glowing but not emitting a light, if that makes sense. The best description I can find that fits is if you go into or under a dark light, where certain colors and things that are like neon really brighten up, but they're not emitting light. That's kind of this yellow eyes that I saw. They were almost captivating, like you could get stuck in a trance staring into them. That whole encounter has stuck with me ever since and has been very disturbing, to say the least. And no, even all these years later, I still have no clue what it is I saw. On the morning of March 20th, 2021, I saw a post stating that the Boeing X-37B orbital test vehicle, some kind of prototype autonomous spaceplane the U.S. Air Force is working on, would be visible in the night sky over in the northern United States and southern Canada. I've never really been that interested in space, to be honest, but I do enjoy stargazing from time to time, and it was a clear night. So, I decided to head out into the hills to try and catch a glimpse of the spacecraft. I tried to convince my boyfriend to come with me, but he was too busy playing Fortnite, or whatever shooter game designed for 12-year-olds that 20-somethings are obsessed with nowadays. I threw an old lawn chair into the back of my new Toyota Tacoma, driving 15 minutes outside of town, where I knew there was a lookout. It was at the end of a long, dead-end dirt road that went up the backside of a ski hill and came out into a large open area that overlooked part of the resort, but more importantly, gave an incredible view of the stars above. I was hoping that nobody else would be up there, since it was the closest thing we had to a lover's lane, where teenagers would go do God knows what in their parents' car. Fortunately, my prayers seemed to be answered that night, as that little parking area was completely deserted. I set up my lawn chair on the grass a few feet away from my truck and gazed up at the beautiful night sky. Even with the almost full moon lighting up the night, there was an incredible amount of stars visible. It was almost overwhelming, especially considering I really had no idea what I was even looking for. I was assuming that I wouldn't actually be able to see the spacecraft itself, and that it would just be some moving lights in the sky, but I didn't know for sure. Every plane passing overhead gave me a little rush, until I realized what it was. Finally, 8:45 p.m. rolls around, exactly when Reddit said it would appear, and there, it was coming over the horizon from the west. This glowing orb of light moving quickly across the night sky. It had a faint ring around it, kind of like the full moon often gets on a clear night, and I knew right away it had to be the spacecraft. I tried to snap a few pictures, but, of course, phone cameras can never capture the true beauty of the night. 5 minutes goes by and it had disappeared off to the east, and I was getting cold. I decided to head home and packed up my chair, got back into my truck. A funny thing about the new Toyota Tacoma is that they come with a GoPro mounted on the windshield, just to the right of the rearview mirror. I guess Toyota finally noticed these trucks are almost exclusively purchased by outdoor adventure seekers. I'm no exception to that, and sometimes like to record footage of my drives on scenic backroads on my way to and from a mountain biking trail, just to add to the video. Oftentimes, this meant I'd get home and leave the camera on my windshield. Well, this time apparently was no exception, because as I got back in the truck, I noticed the camera was sitting there next to my mirror, and I laughed to myself that I had done it again. Then, I noticed something strange. The camera was on, and the little red recording light was blinking. Normally, if I left my GoPro in the truck, or even unattended somewhere in the house, the battery would just die, and I definitely did not turn the camera on. So this was really weird. I was curious, though, as to whether or not the camera picked up anything, since it was a rather bright night out, and my truck was pointed in roughly the right direction, that it might have picked up the spacecraft coming over the horizon. I pulled up my GoPro app on my phone to have a look at the footage, and was expecting to see some of the drive there, but the video started with the truck already parked at the lookout. I wasn't in the shot sitting in my lawn chair, so it was pretty much just a shot of the sky. I saw briefly what I believed to be the spacecraft in the corner of the video, but it was hard to tell on such a small screen, with terrible video quality due to low lighting conditions. I was about to turn the video off when I noticed movement off to the right. This large dark shape that I could not quite make out was moving towards the truck. As it got closer, I could see it more clearly, as it was now above the horizon on video, and so it was silhouetted against the bright night sky. It was a huge creature that must have walked on 2 legs based on its height. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. I couldn't tell if it had horns or ears protruding from its head, but it definitely had something on top. It turned its head, and I caught a flash of red in its eyes as it did so. Then it disappeared from the video. That was all I could take. I let out a scream, threw my phone into the passenger seat, and almost in tears started the truck, peeling out down the dirt road, sending gravel everywhere as I went. I had been sitting out there mere feet away from this monster, without even knowing it was there. I kept expecting to leap out of the trees any second and flip my truck over with its massive arms or something, but it didn't. Every little shadow my headlights cast on the trees made me jump, thinking it was this thing. I just couldn't get over the image of its silhouette out of my mind. I made it to the main road and flew back towards town, doing well above the speed limit. When I got back to the house, my heart felt like I was going to explode. My boyfriend, though, was obviously quite concerned when he saw me walk into the house, in tears, asked me what was wrong. I could barely string together a sentence, and told him to go have a look at the video. I handed him my GoPro and my phone. He tried to get it to work, but couldn't. He pulls out the SD card and puts it into his laptop. While he was doing that, I calmed down enough to somewhat describe what had happened. To my dismay, when he tried to pull up the video, the footage was corrupted. Some skiing footage from winter still left on that card was fine, but the one clip I needed was gone. My boyfriend said it was probably just a bear, since they've been known to walk on their hind legs, and even showed me several videos of bears doing that. Even that's not exactly a comforting thought, but unfortunately, I don't think it was a bear. All the videos he showed me of bears walking on two legs looked almost comical, since they really do look more human than anything else. The way they move is rather clumsy, in stark contrast to the very smooth and methodical movements of the thing I had seen. The silhouette also didn't look the same, but without the video footage to directly compare, and only my panicked memory to go on, who knows what it was.